All right. If everyone can get everybody's attention, I think we're going to get started. I'm going to pass over the mic. I'll let them, since there's a number of them here, I'm sure they'll do a great job of introducing themselves, but I'm going to pass the mic over to them.
Thanks, Ben. So I'm Ben Niffengger, Vice President of Environmental Affairs with Wisconsin Valley Improvement Company. And on behalf of WVIC, we just want to thank Marathon County Historical Society for giving us an opportunity to talk a little bit about the history of WVIC. We have 116 years of history to go through in about 45 minutes. So that's going to be rather difficult. We're likely going to extend beyond that time period, especially if we have questions. So if anyone needs to leave, feel free to stand up, walk out. You aren't going to hurt our feelings at all. We appreciate all of your time today to learn a little bit more about this really iconic historical piece of Wausau and the Wisconsin River system, which I think we'll try to paint that picture for you as we go along. So just a little bit in terms of how this will proceed. I'll kind of set the stage. Peter Hansen, our Vice President of Operations, will talk a little bit about our staffing. And then really we're going to turn the majority of the presentation over to Scott Blado, our Environmental and Safety Specialist. He will be talking about the history of WVIC, the formation, why we were formed. And then he'll kind of fast forward to present day. And Jay Dick, our Technology and Lands Coordinator, will talk about how we operate the river today. And then Scott will kind of wrap up at the end, discussing some of our environmental and recreational programs and initiatives that we do. All four of us will be available for questions at any time. So during the presentation, if you have a question on a particular slide, I think it'd be fine to ask that in the moment. Just get our attention or throw up a hand or interrupt us. Again, that's totally fine. If you have more general questions, we can maybe handle those at the end, and then the four of us can kind of pass the mic on and off depending on the subject matter. So that's a little bit about how this will progress or how we envision it. And so I will try to kick things off here. So Wisconsin Valley Improvement Company is a private corporation, private company. We were publicly chartered by the state legislature in 1907. And so it's very unique in that most other companies similar to us that manage a public water resource are typically a government agency or a government entity. And so Wisconsin is very unique in that we've always been privately owned and funded, but yet we work with the public agencies very closely. So you'll hear the acronym FERC or FERC. That stands for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, the U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. Really, all of those are almost partners. They help kind of set the framework for how we operate. So some of our rules and regulations, and so we act really almost as a public entity in that sense, but we are private. So a lot of people wonder how we get our funding. We really act almost as a nonprofit. And so what we do is we figure out what does it cost for us to operate the river, to upgrade our infrastructure, do our environmental programs, provide recreational facilities, and then we take those costs and then we charge those to the downstream hydro plant owners. And so Wisconsin Valley Improvement Company, we don't generate any electricity. We don't have a bank account where we're rolling in funds or generating revenue from year to year. At the end of the year, we're basically breaking even. So whatever our costs are, 4 times a year, we send out tolls to the downstream hydro plant owners. And those are a mixture of public utilities and paper mills. And that really is how it's been set up ever since 1907. And it still goes on today. A couple of misconceptions about Wisconsin Valley Improvement Company is that we're this large corporation. We have the upper suites at the Dudley Tower. We are a really small group. You're looking at 50% of our staff here today. And so we do have one former staff members. I got to give a shout out here to Bob Wiley, a former president from 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so we just have a long presence in the community. And I think I'll turn things over to Peter here, talk a little bit about some of our office staff.
Thank you, Ben. Peter Hansen, Vice President of Operations. So as Ben mentioned, you pretty much have 50% of our full-time staff here. Added to who's here is Thomas Scharf. He's our board chair emeritus. He's with Consolidated Water Power and just provides some mentorship to Ben and I. Also, Lisa Berger is our administrative assistant. We are located on North 3rd Street. right by the athletic park. And then we have a maintenance facility up in Lake Tomahawk, and we have 3 full-time maintenance staff there. So I think you guys will probably introduce yourselves, so I won't hit that. And I mentioned our field staff. We have the full-time maintenance staff, and then we have, at each location, we have dam tenders, and that's historically what we've done. They're kind of our boots on the ground. They live close to the dams, and that way we're not traveling, because we really have a large footprint here in the northern half of the state. And then some recreational employees at our Burnt Railways boat hoist. We have 3, and then our Cedar Falls campground. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Scott Blado to take it from here.
Hello, my name is Scott Blado. I'm an environmental and safety specialist for Wisconsin Valley Improvement Company, which is ironic because there's really nothing specialized about what I do for the company. I'm very much a generalist. So environmental, water quality, recreation, safety, a little bit of it all. So at 33 years old, there's absolutely no way I can know everything about this company, but I've done my best to sum it up for you guys here today. So I'll do my best. There's a lot of stuff on the back table for you guys. All the books are free, all the maps, feel free to take them. With that, I'd like to start with a little excerpt from the Stewards of Wisconsin book from Mr. Michael Gotch. He kind of sets the stage on what the Wisconsin truly is with a little quote. The Wisconsin River is not a natural, free-flowing river and has not been natural in that sense for now 190 years. Few of us who live in the valley would recognize the natural river of 1830 or choose to live on it. Our demands for energy, employment, residence, and recreation surpass the capacity of the natural river many decades ago. Accordingly, the river has become a resource managed to meet the many demands placed on it by a diverse modern society. So with that, we can't really talk about the history of the Wisconsin Valley Improvement Company without talking about the history of Wisconsin itself. So in the 1830s, early 1800s through the 1880s, timber barons came here to take our most abundant natural resource, which was, of course, timber from northern Wisconsin, and they did a really good job of that. So they were not very selective. They took most of it. They shipped them downstream to markets, to sawmills, for use in cities that were being built at the time. How they did this was they built dams out of timber, and they would artificially raise the water levels in these rivers and natural lakes, and then they would strategically release the water to get the logs downstream. There was no sustainable forestry plan back then. They didn't really have that vision of what would happen once all these are gone. So they greatly altered the landscape of northern Wisconsin. It was all cut over. The natural systems were changed. The wetlands were impacted, the root systems were gone, so the river started to see those effects. The peaks became much higher with flooding, and the lows became much lower with drought as well. So really, it changed everything in the course of Wisconsin history. Here's a couple picture examples of some of those early timber-style dams that they would have used. After this timber era, we kind of moved to hydropower and paper making. So in 1886, the first pulp mill came to Wisconsin Rapids. 1891, the first hydroelectric dam came to Merrill. That was the Scott Lumber Company in Merrill. And in 1893, the first paper mill and power plant combination, which is what we see more today, that combination of paper making and power making. 1893 came to Stevens Point with the Wisconsin River Paper and Pulp Company. So now we have multiple interests, private corporations utilizing the water resource, not a lot of coordination going on between them. They're all kind of using it for their own benefit, their own need. We'll kind of look at the overall kind of origins of this headwater reservoir system. The original idea wasn't really, it was founded from a congressman in western Wisconsin by the name of Thaddeus Pound, and he was worried about agricultural shipping on the Mississippi River, which was experiencing some of the high highs and low lows, just like the Wisconsin was experiencing. So he wanted to increase those flows for agricultural shipping ability. And his idea was to take and make reservoirs in northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota to try to supplement the Mississippi River. and those rivers would be like the Wisconsin main tributaries of the Mississippi. So his idea took a little footing. They have a Corps of Engineers survey that actually surveyed northern Wisconsin and found that 33 reservoirs, which could hold up to 19.5 billion cubic feet of water, could be built in the headwater region of Wisconsin. And that never happened. Mr. Pound left office in 1882, but they got close. The federal government suspended grants of homesteading land in Vilas County in preparation for reservoir building. So he never got to see that come to fruition, but they did build 5 reservoirs in Minnesota. So moving forward here to a more local scale, a man by the name of Mr. William Bradley in 1895, he was kind of the who's who of Tomahawk, founder of Tomahawk, paper, lumber, electricity, telephone. He was the guy for it all. So he was using the water resource along with many of his cohorts, and he kind of saw this same problem. We're all using this. We don't have any way to coordinate it. It's very up and down. We can't count on it. Something has to be done. One quote from him that is in the book there. I have striven for one valley and a common interest. That'd be the Wisconsin River Valley. The water power and log driving interest are both retarded by too much and also by a scarcity of water. It can be remedied, and the general good of the valley should harmonize. So his idea, again, was to privatize the reservoir system. Buy the land, buy the dams, do it himself. He did get started on that, but he quickly realized that was not feasible. In his own words, the legislative route would be best. So a guy by the name of Robert Tweedy was kind of his go-to guy, would manage his paper company, his lumber, electrical company. He was part of this original bill that would have created the WVIC in 1905. At that time, Governor Robert La Follette was in office, and he kind of inherited, I guess you could say he inherited a mess with northern Wisconsin having been cut over. The river was very unpredictable. There was a lot of flooding, also a lot of drought. So like I said, those high highs, those low lows, it was kind of an in-between time. So that was a big task for him. He created the state's first natural resources management agency, which was the Wisconsin State Board of Forestry. And he's quoted as saying, "The restoration of our forests and the preservation of our water powers go hand in hand." So we're kind of in this between time when the forests have been cut over, and now, from many skeptics' views, now they were coming for the water. They wanted to privatize the water. At least that's what they thought. They were kind of pushing back on that. Okay, this will be the next thing that they go to monetize, make money on at the expense of everybody else. So that first bill was met with skepticism, and it was shot down rather quickly without gaining too much traction. There was brief talks of a state agency kind of doing that job, building the reservoirs, managing the system. It was a clause in the state constitution that kind of prohibited that from happening, that said that the investment of state funds for internal improvements was not allowed. So that wasn't going to happen. But everybody kind of knew something had to be done to coordinate the river and get things unified and to a better flow and management. So we move forward to another year later, 1906. A meeting of prominent men in Wisconsin, in Wausau, at the Alexander Stewart Lumber Company, which would have been downtown here. These were the businessmen of the day. Again, paper makers, electric, timber, electricity, telephone, all these guys, political figures, kind of brought everybody together, and then attorneys to kind of map this path forward. How can we make this happen? What is the idea we're trying to get our head around, and how are we going to do it? So these who's who of names of the area got together, and what they came up with is a company should be organized on a fair basis that will result in the most effective use of the Wisconsin River for industrial purposes. And in my mind, when I was reading through this history, it's very interesting that this first, in 1906, their kind of view was for industrial purposes. That's where we started. These are businessmen, of course. This is what we need to unify this so we can make money, the industry can run smoothly, right? But we'll see how that kind of changes as we go through here and the bill comes to be. They wrote up the Articles of Incorporation in September of 1906. They purchased some of the reservoirs that were already existing in the Rapids area in Tomahawk. I'm thinking in Tomahawk probably from the logging companies that had been there and potentially from what Bradley had tried to do previously. And then they set out to acquire the available logging dams and survey the headwaters to see what could be done, what they had to build on, and then a big task was to rewrite the bill of legislature to try to make it come to be. It was met with some opposition, though, primarily in Vilas and Oneida counties. In that time, by rail, people were traveling up to Vilas and Oneida counties to use it similar to what it's being used for today as a getaway for people, businessmen, resort owners, second homeowners. They had real concerns on what would happen now that this would be turned over to this different company. What would they do with the water levels? How high would they go? How low would they go? Would they consider our needs? All these resorts had been set up with these historic water levels already to what was the norm at that time, and they didn't want that to go away. That's what they knew, that's what they wanted it to be. And further opposition came from a small contingent of farming community in Vilas and Oneida County. So after northern Wisconsin had been cut over, there was a push to go and farm that land. It didn't take them long to realize it wasn't the best of farming land. So I think those concerns were kind of second fiddle to more of the, where the money really was on the resorts, the vacation, and the second homeowners. So you can see with this unidentified quote from Rhinelander that I found that this is kind of that skepticism again of people pushing back and just are not sure why people want to control this water resource. Now that the forests have been plundered, these same lords are trying to get in their grasp another natural resource, the water powers, irrespective of individual interests or rights. And below it, we see a quote from Mr. Lewis Alexander, who was one of the founding fathers of WVIC, helped incorporate it. And this is where it kind of starts to switch. As they kind of realize this opposition and what people are concerned about, you start to see some of this language switch from just that industrial nature to what we accomplish should be made to serve all the interests of the river and give no preference excepting what is reasonable and practicable. So now we're kind of transitioning to more of that holistic, everybody wins type of management style. So jump forward to 1907, June 22nd of 1907, the WVIC is codified, and the governor at the time was James Davidson. He signed it. A man by the name of Alexander Reed from Merrill was the attorney, and he was heavily involved with drawing up of the bill and going down to Madison and getting this passed through. And again, it wasn't without opposition, but everybody knew something had to be done, and they got it done. This is still how it reads today. The company shall produce as nearly a uniform flow of water as practicable in the Wisconsin and Tomahawk rivers by storing in reservoirs surplus water for discharge when the water supply is low to improve the usefulness of the river for all public purpose and to reduce flood damage. That's still our mission today. So now we have the WVIC codified, and there was a lot of work for these gentlemen to do. Dam acquiring, building, and improving at the top of the list. So now we had to acquire all these timber logging dams that were on the landscape that had been abandoned since they had served their purpose. Now they were there. However, consider that many of these resorts had been set up with these artificial water levels or what it may be. So there was some want to from people to want to have those remain there too. This picture is from what is said to be the first construction project completed of the new WVIC, which is the Twin Lakes Dam in 1908. And it was a replacement of the old timber structure with a concrete structure. And it looks pretty similar to that today, I would say. One of the cool figures that I enjoyed about reading and preparing this was a man by the name of A.A. Babcock. He was kind of the original operations manager. He was kind of the do-it-all gentleman of the company. He had to be a construction supervisor, hydrologist, record keeper, financial officer, personnel director, and a diplomat. So we had all these different dams, construction projects going on, and he would travel by train or more commonly horse and buggy to go and check on these projects. Now we pick up the cell phone, and in 5 seconds, we've got the guy at Lac Vieux Desert or Rainbow to talk to him about a project. I just thought, the difference in times is just absolutely incredible, and what he must have been met with. Another big task was to establish the water levels, maximums and minimums of the reservoirs. So even then, it wasn't willy-nilly management of the water levels. And at the time, the company was overseen by the newly founded State Forestry Board. So they appointed a man by the name of Clinton Stewart to basically survey the headwater region, assess complaints, and set the levels at which the reservoirs would be maintained. And the product that he produced was the preliminary report on storage reservoirs at the headwaters of the Wisconsin River and their relation to stream flow. I have one copy of that book back there. That one you guys can't take, but feel free to take a look at it if you would like. And the interesting thing is many of those levels that were set by Stewart in that day, many of them are the same today that we use. Here's a chart out of the Stewart report here, just kind of some of his notes. It's all handwritten on his findings on those initial reservoirs, those natural lake reservoirs. And here's an excerpt out of the book of him describing how he would meet with these people and kind of what his task was. Each of the lakes was visited, and where complaints had been made, conferences were held with all of the owners of the summer resorts and private homes. In most cases, 2 conferences were held. The first with the representative of the Wisconsin Valley Improvement Company absent, and the next, about a month later, with the representative of the Wisconsin Valley Improvement Company present, so as to talk over proposed cooperation between the company and summer resort interests. So there was a lot of give and take to be had. And Stewart kind of figured out, okay, here's what they want, brought it back to the company, and then they could make it happen. So soon after all this work started, it became apparent that the natural lake dams, this wasn't going to be able to provide that uniform flow. We were still, this is an excessive event here, but there were still these high highs and low lows. This is the flood of 1912, and looking through some company records at the office, we were able to find the precipitation data for this month in Merrill and Wausau. This is a photo from Merrill here, but that's probably pretty hard to see. But Merrill, in the July 23rd and 24th of 1912, one day 5.9 inches, next day 5.35 inches. So that's 11.25 inches in 2 days. And in Wausau, in those same 2 days, 4.5 inches. So a huge difference by 15 miles. And as we all know, a drop of water doesn't need to fall right where the flooding will occur. And in the Wisconsin River Valley here, if 11 inches of rain falls in Merrill, we will certainly feel the effects here in Wausau, which they did. Here, this photo is right downtown Wausau here. This would be the location, basically, of the current library. This is Schofield, downtown Wausau. So with that said, the company started to realize that we can't serve our mission, we can't provide the uniform flow with just these natural lake reservoirs. They need to build artificial or man-made reservoirs to actually serve this purpose. So that's what they did. They began to set out to acquire this land and to build these artificial reservoirs, which we have the pictures of here. The 5, what we would call the man-mades, were intended to increase the storage necessary so that the river could be further controlled, and that striving for that uniform flow to even out those peaks and valleys. So in 1911, they created the Rice Dam, which some of you may know as Nokomis Lake. It impounds the Tomahawk River, the Rice River, and Little Rice Creek. 1922 was the Spirit River, or the Spirit Dam, which impounds the Spirit River. And that one actually failed from a huge rain event in 1941 as well. Not the physical structure itself, but the left earthen embankment failed on that one. And then the Willow, which impounds the Tomahawk River. That's in Hazelhurst, the Willow flowage. Tomahawk and Willow rivers. And then the Rainbow. I'm always tempted to say it's our only dam on the Wisconsin River, and then I forget about Vieux Desert, which I will share photos of later. But It's our only large dam actually on the main stem of the Wisconsin River. That one was built in 1935. That's where our maintenance shop is located today in Lake Tomahawk. And then the Eau Plaine Dam was the last one, 1937. That's our biggest, and that one impounds the Eau Plaine River, and Fenwood and Freeman Creeks are also pretty big tributaries to that one. Thought we'd spend a little bit more time on that one since we are in Marathon County here. The Eau Plaine Dam, it's our largest. It also has the most usable storage. It is what we like to say is a very flashy watershed, and what we mean by that is the Eau Plaine watershed is full of clay soils. If any of you, like me in northeast part of the county, live in an area with clay soils, you know that its nature, it likes to hold the water. It ponds up in there. This watershed, they wanted to farm it. So a lot of the lands were contoured and or drain tiled very effectively. It sheds the water very well. But that also leads to the water moving very effectively off of fields into drainage ditches and very quickly into the reservoir. So the reservoir can rise very quickly. And it brings with it a lot of nutrients, fertilizers, and things like that that can be harmful. So if any of you have ever heard of any of the environmental issues and algal blooms that we have at the Eau Plaine, that's a large part of it. It's very hard to control that inflow of nutrients. With that said, we do have an excellent fishery there, one of the best walleye fisheries in the state, down at the Eau Plaine. Here's some construction photos of the Eau Plaine. This would have been 1936. If any of you are interested in viewing these a little more closely, just get a hold of me afterwards and we can bring these slides up, or I can share other photos with you as well. And here's completion. And I mean, other than a raised deck, it looks very similar to that today. So that kind of concludes bringing us up through the infrastructure building of WVIC, how we came to be. And it's funny that we can jump forward so far, but once that Eau Plaine Dam was built, largely our infrastructure has remained the same. Have we improved in technology, efficiencies? Obviously a lot of maintenance over the years, of course, but that infrastructure that was built initially remains largely the same today. So just to talk a little bit about the river itself, it's the largest river in the state. It's 430 miles long. It has humble beginnings at Watersmeet, Michigan at Lac Vieux Desert. We have a dam there. And it dumps into the Mississippi River at Prairie du Chien. There's a 1,050-foot fall from Lac Vieux Desert down to Prairie du Chien, and it's a 12,000 square mile drainage area. There are 90-plus tributaries, and the average flow at the source, which would be at the Vieux Desert Dam, is 5 CFS, which we like to compare to a basketball. So 5 basketballs at Lac Vieux Desert, 12,000 basketballs at Prairie du Chien. So that's how much water is picked up along the way. On the left, you see the Vieux Desert Dam. That's where she starts. And the Prairie du Sac Dam is the last one before it becomes what they call the Lower Wisconsin Riverway, below the last dam. It's free flowing from Prairie du Sac all the way down to Prairie du Chien. So the WVIC currently, we operate 21 storage reservoirs. They're the 5 man-mades that we mentioned. Those account for 75% of our storage. And then there's the 16 natural lake dams. In general, we store water during high flow periods, and we release water during low flow periods. And every day, Peter is coordinating communications with the other hydro plants, just as they were way back when. It starts every morning up at Rainbow and all the way down through Alliance Dams. We kind of serve as that intermediary to let everybody know what's going on. Oops. There are 25 hydroelectric dams, none of them of which are owned by the Wisconsin Valley Improvement Company. That we do not make any power. We only store and release water. That was actually a condition of the incorporation of the company to kind of prevent against that, potential corruption or privatization thought that it needed to be more of just an intermediary to store and release water. Those electric dams are indicated here by the red hash marks on the river. Those figures are back there as well if you'd like one. And those provide power for utility customers and sometimes just for on-site paper production as well. And if there's excess at those paper facilities, many times they will sell that excess as well. The reservoir system benefits, obviously the hydropower production. We can keep a steady stream of water. So again, we take those highs and lows, we even them out, which is good. When you talk about, Jay will get to the figure about how hydropower is made. Steady flow is good. You don't want high highs and low lows. You want steady. We're able to reduce the peaks of flood control by 20 to 30%. And we're able to increase water quality by adding flows and fresh water and oxygen and supplementing flows for waste load allocation. So if you can imagine all the cities along the Wisconsin River, they all have wastewater treatment plants. They all discharge. Paper mills discharge. Everybody discharges. They have wastewater. It's treated. Without our storing and releasing of water to have that steady baseline of, I guess you could say, what's it? I want to say dissolution is the solution, but dilution is the solution. Dilution is the solution. So more water, we can allow those wastewater treatment plants to. We're basically diluting, what they're putting in, and then the obvious being the recreational opportunities. If any of you have ever been to the Willow Flowage or the Rainbow Flowage or Lake Nokomis or Spirit or Eau Plaine, not to mention the natural lake dams, there's incredible recreational opportunity that are provided by these dams. So as mentioned before, we are governed under a FERC license. Our project number is 2113. The license we are currently working on was issued in 1996. It was for a 30-year term. My colleagues over here, Ben and Peter, worked very hard a few years ago in a collaborative effort with other dam owners on the river to get this license extended and to coordinate the licenses of other FERC licensees, which would be our member companies, to coordinate the timing of those licenses to better utilize efforts in doing. They require a lot of studies, a lot of collaboration between entities, a lot of review. So it was thought that for the licensees and for the regulators, getting these on a more, instead of, relicensing this project and then that project, we could collaborate more if they were lined up in a way that made more sense. It makes more sense for the licensees. It also makes more sense for regulators, DNR, FERC. So that was a huge part of what they did here a couple years back, and that was kind of a first of its kind effort to align those licensing efforts in the country. And as it was in the beginning, it's our job to balance power and non-power. We don't give any preference to one or the other. We have to take everything into consideration. With that, I'll hand it over to Jay for our reservoir operations section of our presentation.
Thanks, Scott. Well done. Well, now Scott's brought you pretty much up to date at this point. So we'll go through a little bit at the end here to give you kind of an overall, all-encompassing idea of really what the company does at this point in history. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. So, as Scott mentioned, there is a difference in what Wisconsin Valley Improvement does versus what a standard hydroelectric or paper mill might do. In this slide, you'll see hydroelectric dam. What they want is a very consistent headwater level. They want a very consistent level on their lake, on their pond upstream to produce the same flow going through their system. Their turbines, they want the very consistent flow. Gives the same amount of energy. That's not necessarily how we operate. On a storage reservoir, we can vary our head significantly depending on what's on the landscape, what's coming down with rainfall, what the precipitation might be. So in contrast to a hydroelectric dam, our headwater can vary significantly, up to 15, 18 feet depending on precipitation, depending on the year, it changes greatly. All of our operations are very cyclical. They do have kind of a yearly component to them. In the early spring months, obviously, we get a lot of melt, we get a lot of rain, and a lot of runoff. So at that point in the year, we've hopefully drained our reservoirs enough to capture as much of that water as we can to prevent a great deal of flooding downstream. One of our main components of our charter is to help prevent that flooding from any point upriver going downriver. So you can see from this graph the different months of the year. Blue representing months where we typically have more precipitation, typically have more runoff, more water coming into the system. As you progress through the year, June, July, that precipitation tends to kind of die off every year, has historically anyhow. Towards the end of the summer, we might get some clouds, late rain in the days. We do get some August, September rains, and then from about October on through the rest of the year, we either end up with snow or it ends up being fairly dry. So the bottom graph shows you kind of an inverse of rainfall events, snow events. So starting in about April, we're trying to store as much water as we can. You get into the June, July months, we start releasing some. So benefiting those hydroelectric plants, those downriver hydro plants and ponds that need to maintain that consistent headwater level. So we'll release some. Once the August months come again, we'll start to capture some of that water once we have more of a consistent or higher flow in the whole river basin. And then once we get to October, and then obviously through the winter months when there isn't natural rain or natural flows typically going into the system, we are releasing from all of our reservoirs to maintain a consistent flow throughout the river. This gives you a little bit of a picture on how inconsistent things can be from year to year. The blue lines would represent kind of a normal or an average from kind of our historical collection of precipitation data. And this can show you that January, February through the year, how much variation we could typically have in each month. June and July, April, May, we may get a lot of rain. We may not get much at all. Here's a nice graph of kind of the most current cycle we happen to be in. The early 2000s, we were in significant drought throughout the entire state. The graph will show you in that red markings from year to year how much rain deficiencies that the entire system had. And you can imagine how low some of the reservoirs got during those years. Once we started getting out of that, since about that 2010-13 time, we've had a lot of rain. We've had significant and historic rainfalls compared to many of our records. Here's an even further look back at precipitation. Our company is unique that it is so old, and our business has always been water to some degree. So we're tracking rainfall from year to year for the better part of a century and a half now. So this gives you an idea of the cycles that we do go through from decade to decade to decade. The blue being deficient years, where we're much lower than a standard or normal year, and then the reds being excess, much excess rain. every day we're required to kind of track what the precipitation is forecasted to be. It gives us a good idea of, at least in the immediate future, what we should at least be prepared for. So this is a graph that's put together by the National Weather Service that gives us an idea of, this particular graph is how much rain, how much precipitation over the next 5 days, what they're predicting over the next 5 days. This graph being from early November of this year. If anybody can remember, we ended up with some pretty significant rainfalls that first week of November. So this is something that we track at, we track and look at every day. So this gives a bit of an example of what we would consider our range of operation from a wet year to a dry year, and then kind of that normal average year in between. So this is the Old Plain Reservoir outside of Mosinee. Shows you an average of the very low years when it, historically, it would drain just about down back to the river channel. On a high year, it would remain, it would get full at that first melt, and it would stay very full all year long. Typically, we're more of that blue line where we're draining, releasing water all through the winter. We come to about the March time period. We know things are starting to melt. We close the gates somewhat to start to capture all of that water, and you get this rise, the blue line in the middle. Throughout the summer, as the year goes on, month to month, there's a slow drain, and then once you get to the November, December area, we're in that same drawdown and release to help supplement flows throughout the winter season. So there are four main components to our operating plan. Maximum and minimum water levels. Scott touched on that a little bit, and yes, the vast majority of them are really associated back to that early 1900 study. They have not adjusted on the natural lakes. When they talked to those resort owners, they were accustomed to having it at a certain elevation at that point, and there were also records taken of where it was historically low or where the natural river may have been, and we tend to operate within that band still to this day. Second component, the minimum flow necessary out of each one of these reservoirs. 21 different reservoirs. They all have some sort of stream below them. They all have different ecology below them. And each one of these dams, we are required to release a minimum flow. We can't just shut them off. There has to be a certain amount of water flowing out of every dam. A main component is then also flow goals. Scott mentioned waste load allocations. A lot of our flow goals are based a bit on waste load allocations all up and down the river. So we have 2 points on the river that we track flow goals. One is in Merrill, and one is in Wisconsin Rapids. So our goal throughout the entire season is to meet these certain goals. They do change month to month, periodically throughout the whole year, depending on what is historically needed, what is existing in the reservoir system right now, how much water is in the system, and we'll adjust daily to try to match those goals. The last being, I think most important, is what we consider index levels. We call index levels, meaning those big five that were created, we need to utilize those big five equally. So if there are 4 of them that are very full in the spring after all that melt, one is still very low, we need to use the water stored in those 4 that are very full before we can start using that one that is low. We need to use them all the same or equally to not to put preferential treatment to one specific reservoir. So here's just a graphic of what our maximum and minimums are for all 21 reservoirs. They do change seasonally, winter and summer. Summer months, most of the natural lake reservoirs we try to keep them relatively full, obviously for recreation purposes. And then in the winter months, when we actually need to utilize that water to supplement the flow in the river, that's when we're allowed to start to drop those during the winter months. Varies by reservoir, seasonal differences. Some in-license changes listed up on here. Throughout the course of our current license, we've had some changes to this, but they're pretty much the same as they were initially set. Some of the minimum flows were required. Just briefly, I'll touch on the dam safety program. We don't just leave those sit out there and when we never look at them. We have a pretty robust dam safety program. There's lots of eyes on these things all the time. Weekly, monthly, quarterly, depending on who's doing it, but there's always lots of eyes on these. Touch on tolls real fast. Ben and Scott both touched on this a little bit. Our toll, what we toll out, the monies that we request from our member companies, are really just the costs of what it took to operate and provide water to those plants and to those hydro owners. Hand this back over to Scott, and we'll see if we can fly through the last little bit of all the other things we do.
Again, if anybody has to get up and go, feel free. We'll try to fly through the end of it here, but so underneath the FERC license, that kind of is our overarching guiding post. We have multiple different plans. So what Jay just went over, that's kind of all part of our operations plan. In addition to that, we have a water quality monitoring plan, land resource management plan, historic resource management plan, recreation management plan, and a fish and wildlife management plan. So these are all multifaceted. I'll kind of touch on a few of those here. Our fish and wildlife plan, this is where we kind of get to have some fun in the spring a lot of times. We actually have written into our plan that our environmental staff, which is pretty much Ben and I, will assist the DNR with any fisheries surveys that are done in our reservoirs, which usually there's at least one per year. There's 21 of them, so they're fairly evenly spread out, but we have our own boat set up, and we just provide hands for the DNR and help them out. So I think this was last year for me with a muskie, I think, on the Sugar Camp chain, and then Ben with, it might be, not sure which water body, but a load of walleyes there. So that's one of the things we really enjoy that we get to do. So a lot of bigger companies, we feel so blessed because we do a lot of the work that a lot of bigger companies would just contract out or pay for or whatever. So we take the more hands-on approach to actually physically providing that service. We've got threatened and endangered species, something we have to consider with any projects that we do. Timing wise, what we can do when, what we have to consider based on what might be in the area. Aquatic invasive species, we don't do a whole lot of hands-on on that. We have a little bit of purple loosestrife plans, but we basically partner and help out whenever we're asked or needed on that. We have a bald eagle protection plan, so when the license was issued in '96, bald eagles were imperiled, much more concerned than they are today. But we still do have a lot of consideration for the nesting locations as far as work that can be done, what time of the year, and what can be done around them. Our water quality monitoring program, the three main ones are a headwater, tailwater. That's a long-term trend study, oxygen and temperatures at the headwaters, which is the upper side of the dams, and the tailwaters, which is the lower side of the dam. So dissolved oxygen and temperature, just getting profiles 2 times a month. That's something that I do. Allows me to get out to the dams, check things out, look for any anomalies. Our trophic state index and quarterly monitoring, those are 3 years out of every 10. So we just finished up 2020 to 2022 with the 3-year cycle of these. That's on the TSIs on all 21 of the reservoirs. So the last 3 years for me have been spent a lot of time in a boat on all 21 of the reservoirs. So that's been very busy, but excellent. It allowed me to, get to know the system, get to know the water bodies. When questions come in, that comes right to your head of where you're talking about. You kind of get more intimate with that. So we provide all that data to the state, to the FERC, just kind of as baseline data. And this stuff goes back, way back. So it's not really taking a sample, okay, we're seeing something about it and doing something about it. These are more long-term trend studies. We're not making any management decisions unless anybody tells us there needs to be something done. In other words, we're not interpreting it. One other I should mention, on the Old Plain, we do this time of the year, as I mentioned, with the high nutrient load in the Old Plain, there can be some dissolved oxygen issues out there. So this time of the year, part of my position is that I'll be monitoring the dissolved oxygen and temperature out there, usually weekly by snowmobile all the way from the dam up to where it turns into a more riverine system. We use that data to help us, in cooperation with the DNR and the county, to inform our decisions on starting the aerator system, which some of you might be familiar with, and if we have time at the end, I do have some photos of that, but I want to be respectful of your time too. Our erosion control monitoring is another part of what we do. Reservoirs raising levels up and down can cause havoc on shorelines. We're most concentrated on anywhere that there might be a wreck site or where there might be a cultural resource that needs to be protected would be priority for us to establish some kind of erosion control. Again, cultural and historical resources. If you can imagine, before the reservoirs were formed, these were hot spots for Native American encampments along rivers, the confluence of rivers, high banks. So we're responsible for knowing where they are, protecting them, taking all means necessary, and even some of our own infrastructure with its age is eligible for National Register of Historic Places. So even when Peter's drawing up projects to do maintenance on any of our smaller dams, we have to go through that process to make sure we check all the boxes that there's no special procedures or anything that need to be taken to protect those. We have a lot of land holdings, so our areas from the Old Plain down by Mosinee all the way up to Lac Vieux Desert. So around those, especially around the dam sites at Lake Nokomis, we have a ton of land. Along the natural lake reservoirs, we tend to have a lot of land that was acquired that was needed to flow the lands. So if you can imagine, those lands were dry. They needed to be purchased and bought up so that they could be flowed. Either that or we have flowage rights if they're not owned by us. If the land is owned by us, everything, if you see WVIC's name on it, is open to the public. We don't allow metal detecting, camping, fires, four-wheelers that aren't on designated trails, things like that, just to protect our resource. Everything's so remote, and like you said, very limited staff. We don't have the ability to monitor everything, so we want it needs to be open. That's a requirement of the FERC, that all of our lands are open without discrimination to the public. Our recreation management plan, it's a huge part of what WVIC provides, really. I mean, that's the public's interest in it at this point. Obviously, we all get energy, but that's kind of all, a blind eye to it. What they know it for is the recreation that it provides, the fishing, the boating, the swimming, all of that. So there's 124 public recreation sites throughout our system. Not all of those are owned by us. 24 of them are owned and managed by us. So our maintenance crew takes care of a lot of that. I take care of a lot of the logistics with that. This upper right picture there, that's a fishing pier, very popular at our Rainbow Dam in the tailwater. We just rebuilt that here 2 years ago. Very heavily used. Our crew did a great job on that. That one was washed out in a terrible mishap with high flows. So it was redesigned and it's back up and running. So we take care of the maintenance of all of our sites. We improve them. We provide accessibility. So many of them are old. They're not the most accessible. So one of our projects we're doing at the Burnt Rollways boat hoist, which we'll see here in a minute, is we're providing an accessible way to get onto that boat hoist, to get onto the hoist for those who might be challenged with mobility. We do also have a grant program for providers of public recreation on our reservoirs. That's called the Recreational Facilities Assistance Program. So that's on a yearly basis. We administer that and either offer in-kind services from our crew to provide either the work or building of something, or monetary funds. And we also monitor the usage of the rec sites. So that's something we did in 2021. We monitored the usage of all the rec sites, not just the one that we own. That's a condition of our FERC license. So we basically need to prove to them that the infrastructure that is surrounding our reservoirs for recreation is sufficient for the public. Everything that they're calling for is met. You know, there's enough boat landings, there's enough swimming, there's enough fishing points. So we monitor that, report to them, and they can make that determination. So two of our most historic and popular site, I would say, is the Burnt Rollways boat hoist. This is at the Three Lakes Dam, if any of you are familiar. It's between the Three Lakes chain of lakes and the Eagle River chain of lakes. It would actually be on what is considered to be the Eagle River. This boat hoist was a condition of placing the dam in this location. We go back to those wealthy resort owners. That is a huge, if any of you have ever boated on the Eagle River Three Lakes chain, that chain is the largest freshwater chain of lakes in the world. People like to boat all around it. So that was a condition of placing this dam, as they needed to be able to go to both sides. So if there's a dam there, obviously you can't just boat through. A boat hoist needed to be built to go up and over. So this picture is a picture of the original boat hoist, which went up and over, right over the dam on a railway. That was constructed and finished in 1910 or 1911. The dam was finished in 1909. And it's kind of funny, some of the stuff I was reading, people were they could find anything to complain about the company. They were upset that it was a month behind schedule and the company wasn't acting in good faith and all this. So just kind of funny, but it looks a little different today. I think Bob had a hand in designing the current iteration, which was put there in 1952. I'll have a kind of a neat photo coming up here that shows what it looked like then, what it looks like now. We lift, up to 1,400 boats every year. It's kind of a tourist attraction. People just stop by there to see the boats come up and over. That's really what it is. You go there, put your boat on the lift, go to the other side, have lunch, come back, kind of thing, boat around. Somebody here asked about why it was called Burnt Rollways, and I do have that historical tale here. It was basically a group of lumberjacks had a bunch of logs ready to go downstream, just upstream of the Burnt Rollways Dam, which a lot of people call it the Three Lakes Dam, but just upstream is 9 Mile Creek that comes in, which we actually have a dam up on 9 Mile as well. Apparently they didn't get paid for the log shipment that was supposed to go downstream, so they were upset with that. They lit the whole thing on fire on the railway. This is just what the history tells me. I don't know if it's true or not, but apparently then it sunk up there by 9 Mile, and I guess that's where it lays today. So that's the Burnt Rollway. That's the rollway that the logs were on that sunk when those lumberjacks got mad that they weren't getting paid. So they said, if we're not going to get paid, you're not going to get your logs, basically. Here is the reconstruction of the boat hoist. This would have been in '52 when you can see, I don't know if there's a laser on here, over here was the original boat hoist coming up and over the dam, and they had to dredge this out here. This is the current location of it over here to the side of the dam. Here's some of the photos of the construction of it. This has just brought me right back, because this is, you'll see the current photos of it. It looks just like this. So I thought these were really, really cool photos. You can see them driving in the posts up here. I want to say, Ben and Peter, this might be the boat. In the state statute, it says that the company has to provide navigation ability for 50 feet long, 5 feet deep, and 12-foot breadth, I believe. And we all wonder, when is that boat coming over the hoist? But we think that there must have been a gentleman with that boat that said, I better be able to get mine over the hoist. So this might be it. I don't know. It's pretty big. So here, this is a photo from '52 when the hoist was first constructed, and this is a photo I took last year. So, I mean, very few differences, and we still get these steamboats. Every year they have kind of a consortium that comes up and comes over, and luckily last year I happened to be visiting the hoist that day when they were there. They're so cool. But it's just a piece of history. I mean, really all we did there was add color, right? And then one other neat thing that we do is we operate the Cedar Falls Campground. This is kind of operated outside of our FERC license. It's on the Willow Flowage, right where the Tomahawk River comes in. Beautiful falls that come over. We've got 42 campsites there. 18 of them are seasonal. We have electricity there, showers, restrooms, laundry, great access to the flowage. There's a boat landing to access there. Great fishing. It's just a beautiful, beautiful site up in Hazelhurst there, if any of you would ever like to check that out. Ben, I know we're crunched for time here. If you want us to wrap it up, we sure can. I think I had some photos of the aeration system. This is the big old plane. So over here, this is the county, how am I oriented here? County Park on this side? Yep, okay. County Park here. Bob, maybe you took these pictures from your plane, I don't know. County Park here, aerator would be over here. So basically we have a system of, here's us doing our weekly dissolved oxygen monitoring on the old plane. The conditions can vary a lot out there. So we do the sampling by snowmobile. This is the product that we come up with to help us to make these informed decisions on the aerator. This is called an isopleth, and this is something that I generate each week that tells us what the oxygen conditions are looking like in the reservoir. So this is 2019, the 15th of January. This would have been the first day that we went out for the year and monitored. This is kind of hard to explain or decipher, but blue is good. Up here on top, this is a side profile of the reservoir. If you can envision this, here we have, this is a bottom profile of the reservoir, and we're looking at the side. If you cut it, and we're looking at the side, the dam's over here where it's real deep, and this is all the way upstream, 18 river miles. So down here we have, some red. We're starting to lose some oxygen off of the bottom. It's called hypolimnetic demand. The oxygen eats away from the bottom. Up here on the top, we're good. This is where most of our flow comes through the reservoir, up on the top. And here you'll see, as the winter moved on, this I think was our last profile of the year. We have nearly nothing here. That hypolimnetic demand has eaten everything almost all the way to the top. And at this point, we would have been running the aerator for over a month. And the aerator's here. This is a limited profile, but the aerator really doesn't send a huge footprint downstream. It's more of a localized refuge. Here's Jay working on our aerator here. There's 14 lines that come out of two main lines, split off into 7 each, and they go out into the reservoir to create these holes here. So it's the wind action and the exchange of oxygen with the water that actually provides the oxygen and limited refuge. And a couple years ago, we went and actually took some on a jumbo and actually took some oxygen profiles in one of the holes that was opened up, just to compare it to what it was looking like upstream and downstream, and to where upstream or downstream might have a 2 or a 3 oxygen in there. We had pretty much a 6 up and down, so it was doing its job. One of the interesting things that we'd like to see go through, we've been pushing for a while, is the DNR is kind of trying to put it together now. Our colleagues over there is to see how the fish are actually using the reservoir, to see how they're actually using the aerator. So we're trying to, we have really nothing to do with it at this point, but they're working to try to put together kind of a telemetry study to see how that works. So with that, it's about all we have. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask any of us. We'll stick around for a while too if there's anything you wanted to see in the presentation. We can certainly go back or provide more information or pictures or whatever you would like. So thank you all. Any burning questions? Go ahead.
You mentioned the tolls that are charged to the users.
Go ahead.
What are we talking in dollars for those?
Well, they're available to the public, so right now we're in the $5 million range annually.
Thanks.
Yep.
So just thinking of more intense rainfall events with climate change. You know, we've had in Niffengger watershed, 12-inch, 11-inch, 24-hour rainfall events, Superior, Ashland. What would that look like in the Wisconsin River Basin today?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the issue with these extreme weather events is it really depends exactly where that water falls. So I can tell you, we had talked about the flashiness of the Big Old Plain Reservoir. That's an area where we wouldn't be sleeping very well that leading up to an event like that in the Old Plain. We know the water level is going to come up quick. That's the whole point of us taking advanced action and tracking. What are they predicting over the next 5 days? If we see something like that coming, we're taking preemptive measures to basically raise the gates, let out water so that we have capacity. And so that's part of our job, is just tracking that. You're never going to be able to forecast everything, 100%. And so there is always some unknowns there. But that's really the whole point of what we're doing every morning, is to look at what do we need to do now to take advance of that. But even with the whole system that we have, we're still all reliant on what Mother Nature gives us. And when you have those events up in Ashland, I mean, there was bridges out and roads out, and there's only so much preemptively you can do for that.
Kind of a tangent off from that. Is there any comparable system for the Chippewa River system?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of comparable systems or companies, there's the Chippewa Valley Authority as well. They were actually created in the Wisconsin state statutes. So if you look up the state statutes, you'll see WVIC listed, statute 182, et cetera. Chippewa River Valley is the next statute. And so they do have that on the Chippewa River system. They have a series of storage reservoirs as well. You can think of like the Turtle Flambeau flowage, and that would be Xcel Energy manages those storage reservoirs that then supplement some of the hydro plants over there. Other than those two river systems, we're really not aware of any other private entities that have privately managed reservoir systems like we do, really throughout the country. They're typically always going to be a government entity. So you can think of the Tennessee River Valley Authority. They manage a lot of the rivers and reservoirs in Tennessee, but they're a government agency. Same with like the Army Corps of Engineers.
How about the Wolf River, the Fox Valley? Anything going on there?
There's certainly hydro plants on those rivers. So there's paper mills and hydroelectric generating facilities, but I'm not aware of any reservoir systems that they really have to strictly for storage. I think all of those are tied in with the generation of electricity.
I'm surprised to see that there are 25 hydroelectric dams. Do you know how many of those sell power to the grid and how many of them keep their power? I think that Rothschild doesn't hardly sell any. They use most of what they make at the paper mill.
Yeah, most of the paper mills, their primary purpose is to generate electricity for their own use. So as you're kind of working your way down the river in Rhinelander, now it would be the Alstrom-Munkshoe Dam. That is a paper mill as well. So they're likely primarily using that for their own operations. Then moving down, next one would be probably the Mosinee Mill. Again, that's primarily for them to generate electricity for the paper making. And then as you go down a lot more, paper mills down into the rapids and as you work down that way. So I don't have an exact number, but if there's a paper mill associated with it, then it's not necessarily generating electricity for the public. The big public utilities would be Wisconsin Public Service dams, like here in Wausau, and then Alliant Energy as well. Down further south, the Prairie du Sac Dam and Kilbourne's. And then you have Wisconsin River Power Company generating electricity for...
Is there more potential, say, at the Rothschild Dam? Is there more potential, or did they just size their turbines for what they would need, and said that we aren't interested in anything beyond that?
So all of the hydro plants are independently owned and operated, so we just don't have the knowledge base to really know why they were designed or how they were designed, but I could talk in more broadly kind of how power's generated, Peter, just with drop.
Yeah, so I would say each of those hydros were designed based on the capacity, the location that they were at within the river. I mean, they only have so much drop from location to location. So, you know, yeah, exactly. And so if in that area they can only produce so much water, the size of the generators were sized accordingly. So, you know, back when these were built, many of them even a century, you know, pushing a century ago, the technology itself and how hydroelectricity is produced hasn't really changed. So I would say they're maxed out to the capacity of their location within the river. Now, there are some of the hydros, many of them, that their generators are in need of repair and they might not be available. And again, I don't think we should, you know, speak for each of them, but they have the capacity, and whether they're not running at full capacity is really a decision of their own, and based on maintenance issues or what it would, you know, issues like that. Mm-hmm.
How do your operations coordinate with those other dams, if they do?
That's a great question. So Jay was talking about, you know, our morning routine starts up at Rainbow. We make that decision on what we're going to do at Rainbow, and then at the Rhinelander Dam, they then get an email from us with that data. They submit an email that goes to the Kings Dam. So then they know what's going to do, and so there's a cascading effect where we're providing that detail of operations down the river. And some of them are emailing us and letting us know. But, you know, prior to me coming on board just over 10 years ago, it was all by phone call. Now we can all do it electronically. When I was sitting over there, I saw that Rhinelander made an operational change, just as an email that popped up on my phone. So we can still run that way. I mean, we are beholden to the internet, and systems go down and crash, but we can still be making phone calls.
But the goal is for a particular flow level based on conditions?
Yeah, you know, like especially this winter, I begin like in November kind of reaching out to all of them, going even back to this gentleman's question. Some of them just might not be able to produce as much as they normally would with their generators, so then they're depending on gate operations, and gate operations in the winter is not easy. You know, we've got a steamer that we take from behind a large pickup truck to haul that's full of water, and many of those locations have the same thing. You know, operating gates in the winter is not easy, so I take that into account as we try to make our decisions. Jay showed how, you know, we draw down in the winter. We operate much differently probably than they did, you know, decades and decades ago, because of our FERC license and just, you know, those restrictions that they have. If they're down a generator or two, I need to know that, and we try to work with them.
To your question as well, they mentioned the flow goals. So based on different time of the year, there is a number, that CFS number at Merrill or Rapids, that needs to be hit. So we need to at least be here. There's usually a bracketed, here's our goal. We need to at least be here. We can be up to here. A lot of times it's out of their hands. If, you know, the reservoirs are full and it's raining a whole bunch and the ground is wet. So there's a lot of times where we're quote unquote wasting water, or the hydros are wasting water. We can't store it, they can't use it. But in general, we're trying to meet those goals.
I'd like to add one more thing too. Jay had shown a graphic of the whole United States and what we call the QPF, the precipitation over the next 5 days. Starting in around 2010, when we were getting those, there was a really large event that happened. Wisconsin Rapids, Stevens Point was kind of the eye of it. You know, it was 6-7 inches of rain and probably some historical high flows there. That triggered us starting a process where, so in Chanhassen, Minnesota, that is a suburb of Minneapolis, National Weather Service has a river forecast center just for the Wisconsin River. And we work with them. We get data from them every day. We get emails and pull data every day. But as we start to see those events coming, I'll start coordinating with them and the river owners to start preemptively talking about what are we going to do with operations, and we'll start making decisions based on that. But so we should give a lot of credit to them. They're a huge resource for us. You were going to add?
I was just going to add something to flow goals, because a lot of times people ask, why is there a certain flow in the Wisconsin River? And those goals are usually set a little bit higher in the summer, and it's not for hydropower production at all. The primary reason for those goals is for the waste load assimilation. So when Scott had mentioned, and Jay, all of the different entities that end up discharging waste into the river, the way to deal with that is to send cold, oxygenated water downstream. And so the colder the water and the more flow, typically the more waste that can be distributed. And so that's where we all kind of take for granted, I think, the flow in the Wisconsin River. If you look out there during dry periods of time, 50% of that flow could be coming from our reservoirs. And so you imagine if we didn't have the system in place, there being 50% less water in the river when you're walking downtown here. It's really hard for us to kind of grasp that, but there's a huge environmental component to why there is a need for those high flows in the summer. So, yep.
It was asking, we're flushing all of this waste further downstream to somebody else. Is there somebody at the end that's going to find it and treat it?
Yeah, there is actually. The Gulf of Mexico has a giant dead zone where nothing can live. So just to be totally frank, and that's not just from the Wisconsin River, but that's from the Mississippi, every tributary going into the Mississippi. You look at the heartland of how we generate, crops and agriculture. When we talk about the heartland, that's the Mississippi River area. And that gets back to Scott's point, where our hardest environmental challenge is the Eau Plaine Reservoir. And that's because of the soils and because of the heavy agricultural and nutrient loading that comes in. That all makes its way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So the Eau Plaine's not unique there. There's many watersheds that are dealing with that. And there's a lot of good initiatives and a lot of good groups, one of which WVIC is actually part of, is the Eau Plaine Partnership for Integrated Conservation. And it's a mixture of some county and state agencies, but then also local farmers and producers and seed suppliers and other nonprofits that are interested in water quality, working to change some of our agricultural practices. There's ways to generate food, to save soil that are still economical, but then also beneficial for the watershed. And so there's been a big push in the last decade really to partner to change some of our agricultural practices. And that's something that we have a vested interest in because we want to support the fishery on the Eau Plaine. So that's just another side component. We wear a lot of hats and a lot of tangents, as you've learned here. That's one of them. Yep.
How does what you do play into the determination of who is in and who is out of a floodplain? And I'm thinking of a couple of different instances, and maybe you guys aren't directly involved in that.
Yeah, I don't know that we would be directly involved. I'm sorry. So the question was, what we do, how does that influence or determine whether someone's home is in or out of the floodplain? Because we don't have any ownership or really dam control on the Wisconsin River itself, other than the Rainbow Reservoir up north, and then Lac Butte is there at the headwaters, we're really not involved in that. Most of those elevations you see on the main stem of the Wisconsin River, those are set by separate federal licenses that each of those hydro plants owners have. So when Scott had mentioned we have our Federal Energy Regulatory Commission license, that's for our 21 storage reservoirs. That spells out what we can and can't do. Each of those hydro plants, each of those red facilities you see on that map, they have their own federal license with their own regulations. That they have a max and a min water level. Now, of course, that's what we try to operate to, but then you have Mother Nature throwing us a curveball with 12 inches of rain. Even a well-established floodplain elevation is going to be exceeded. So it's all based on modeling, and actually the federal government deals with a lot of the floodplain type issues, along with county zoning and state, DNR. Thankfully, we don't have to get involved with regulating floodplains. Yep.
A few years ago, the dam here in Wausau was undergoing maintenance, and the level of the Wisconsin River north of the dam was down to a trickle. What changes in your operations to make that happen? And what do you have?
That's a good question. So we weren't responsible for that dam and the drawdown, but we knew about it ahead of time. They let us know, and then I started coordinating. So what we would do is when they're going to draw down, they're going to add some extra flow into the river. I would let the downstream dam owners to them know that, and that might probably, depending on the time of year, affect our operations out of the Old Plain. Old Plain is a big reservoir when it comes to supplementing, south of the Mosinee area. So maybe at that time I can cut back flow out of the Old Plain then, because we're going to have that additional water. So during construction, whatever is coming in is going out through the Wausau Dam when they're doing construction. So there's not a lot of coordination then, but if a big storm's going to come, I'm going to let them know so they can let their contractors know that something big is coming. It could involve them actually having to pull off of the site. Alliant Energy's had some big projects going on down at their dams, down at the end of our system, and I know some of their contractors literally would have to demobilize for a week or so because of high flows coming. So yeah, all that coordination comes from WVIC. That's kind of expected of those dam owners, that we'll take the lead on that. And then when they're going to refill, project's done and they're going to refill, then now we might have to start doing some extra supplementing from the Old Plain, because when you refill, you're cutting back what's being released. But those sites in those lakes behind those dams are actually quite small. So you don't really feel a lot of the impact when they're either refilling or drawing down. Different than us, who are, our reservoirs are some of the largest in the system. So when we're going to do that, either refilling or drawing down, there's much more flow impact downstream. But
I would add too to that, just that's a very involved process for them, for WPS, as far as with DNR and the FERC. There would have had to be a drawdown plan for them, monitoring. They're going to ask the questions, okay, what do we do about the fishing? Well, they close the fishing season down. They would have had to have monitored for mussels, other species that might be impacted by that. So that's where, all those different articles of our license that we have, they all come into play when we have a project like that. If we were to have a drawdown or something, there's coordination from the top down, from the federal agencies, the state agencies, to us physically would have to be out there monitoring, checking for these things to make the whole project happen. Go ahead.
So during the Wausau drawdown, was the flow into, I don't know if they call that Wausau Lake or whatever, but flowing, was the flow into that restricted? Or was what we were seeing during the drawdown the actual flow that was at all areas?
That would have been the base flow essentially, right? So what was the base flow of the river? There was no extra. There was no ponding going on. So whatever was coming down the river, that amount needed to be passed through the gates. What came in went out, right? So there's no artificial impounding going on that, out into the plain.
Saw a huge difference between then and when it's being retained by the dam.
Correct. That's why I led the presentation with, there's nothing natural about what it is today. It's natural to us because we go over it every day. It's so consistent. That consistency really can be owed to WVIC, but the natural river was the flood of 1912 and a trickle like you saw during the construction project. So,
Kind of an abstract question, but have the reservoirs that you monitor basically taken the place of what it was before it was deforested? You ever wondered about that? How are we artificially, or have the forests rebounded sufficiently so that, you know what I mean? Would we still need to have this?
well, with the coordination, that is an abstract question. That's a good one to think on. I think there would still be a need for cooperation amongst hydropower users on the river. Now we've gotten so far with the infrastructure of our dams, the recreation they provide, even the supplemental flow to these downstream. We've probably created a lot of habitat, in our tailwaters, or sustained a lot of it that might have suffered in those times of low flow in natural times. So it's certainly a tinkered with system, and it's artificial. And and we play within those current bounds, I guess.
Yeah, that's good.
I like abstract questions. I think what we see now with the forest kind of rejuvenating, especially in the north, is that it does a great job of being able to absorb rainfall and runoff. And so that's the reason, the issues we have on the Eau Plain, because of the agricultural landscape, we don't have those issues in northern Wisconsin. And that's because the wetlands, the trees, the vegetation can hold millions and millions of gallons of water. And so the water eventually makes its way to the Wisconsin River, but it's a slower process now, certainly than it was during the cutover period. But ultimately, to reduce flood damage, you still need the capacity to hold that water somewhere, and the landscape, even in an unmanaged natural system, doesn't have the capacity to hold 10 or 12 inches. We might not have the capacity, but with the reservoirs, we have more capacity than what you would have naturally. So that's those 5 man-made reservoirs. 75% of the storage we talked about comes from those developments. Those weren't here on the landscape. Those were just riverine systems. But with that 75% storage is also 75% of the water you see out here is coming from those five reservoirs that wouldn't exist without them being there. Yep.
I'm just curious about the people who are the dam tenders. I assume you rely a good deal on them as well. And what's their relationship to you? Are they employed by you? Are they volunteers? What role do they play?
Since I'm going to send this video to them, I want them to hear how important they are. They're of huge importance to us. Jay covered the dam safety program, which I'm a dam safety engineer, but each one of them does an inspection every month. But they really are our boots on the ground, our eyes and ears of what's happening in the area. And you think about if we didn't have them, the kind of mileage that either our maintenance crew would put on or I would put on going and making those changes. So they all tend to live relatively close. They are our employees. They're part-time hourly employees. I couldn't operate without them. They're really important. Some have been with us for, our Squirrel Dam tender has been there for 42 years. So Bob, you would have hired Sil Raven. You were with us until 86? 1986, you said? Yeah. So one of his dam tenders is still with us.
So one fun historical aspect that doesn't really make it into this because it's real brief and short are all of these remote dams, remote reservoirs, how that data gets to us, right? So way back it was monthly reports would be sent in, a lot of letter correspondence back and forth that obviously would have taken some time to get from here to there, back and forth. Then it changed to postcards. We'd get a little postcard from them once a week. Then it kind of changed to phone calls. Now we're doing emails. So that's been our historical progression from that.
And I should add, when the gates aren't frozen, most times they make the decisions on what need to be done. I mean, they really, I don't know that it's exactly raining right there at that time, and so they do an excellent job of operating. Oftentimes they're going to call me, especially if they have a question, concern with rain, and hey, Peter, what do you think I should do? This is what what I'm thinking. But for the most part, they have a window of how they're supposed to operate, and they have it down to a science. And when you do it for 42 years, like some locations, who am I to tell them how to operate on a day-to-day basis? Yes.
Given the bodies of knowledge you all have to have, I'm curious about your backgrounds. What kind of training, what kind of education? I mean, it's so broad.
We'll work our way through here.
I'm a licensed land surveyor, so I've been in the land information side for a long time. I also have an engineering degree, so I've kind of got a wide background on kind of that aspect. So the operations wise, some land issues. So that's my background.
Environmental sciences, started out in consulting and then made my way to WVIC. But when you work here, you kind of have to learn the history. We have so much infrastructure, so much different things we do. So we've all just brushed up on that.
I'm a civil engineer. I went to school at Michigan Tech. So what's funny about me is, I was raised up in the UP, a baby of 5, and all my siblings moved down to central Wisconsin, and I'm like, how am I going to, I want to end up by them, so I figured I'd have to go into paper science. I'd say all of us would say we're really blessed to be with WVIC. I worked for a consultant in Stevens Point for 16 years, and now I've been here. So I thought paper science would be how I'd get to be part of this, but instead I'm really getting to manage the river. So that's my background.
I graduated from UW Stevens Point with air, water, and natural resource management. So it was focused on kind of the public policy, so how natural resources decisions get made, at the local, state, and federal level. And I worked for Lincoln and Langley County, their zoning departments helping with shoreline development projects. And then I thought I would, kind of get out of the public sector, not have to deal with as much of the public criticisms I got in zoning. And then I came to WVIC, and that takes up probably 50% of my time is just dealing with, the public interactions, zoning regulations, and some of the managing natural resources is relatively easy, but managing people is a whole different story. So
I think we're kind of hit the point. I'm sure we can keep asking questions, and I understand they might be willing to stick around and answer questions for you afterwards, but I think we've kind of gone about half an hour over what we usually do, so we're probably going to wrap this up here. So if you would just join me in one more time, big thanks to all of our...
I was looking around the room to see if I recognized anybody from ever calling and complaining or stopping in and complaining or anything.
We will need everyone's names.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.